Good evening and welcome to Fibeable live stream about the Enlightenment. Can everyone hear me loud and clear? Tonight's stream is specifically about the Enlightenment, which could be a great topic for a DBQ this year. We have no idea still what the DBQ will be, but if it's Enlightenment, so tonight's stream will be very helpful in that. All right. All right, so remember, think Fibeable, checking Fibeable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Check the replays, updates on what's currently going on. So tonight's stream, what are we covering tonight? So tonight we'll talk about what was the Enlightenment in general, what did it stand for, the values of the Enlightenment. We'll talk about John Locke. It's kind of like a forebear of the Enlightenment, just before. We might want to put also into context, if we write something about the Enlightenment, that John Locke is a background to it, or the English Revolution. A lot of times students get confused. What's the connection between the English Revolution or the Enlightenment or the French Revolution? We had a DBQ a few years ago about the English Revolution, and a lot of students got confused about that. So we'll try to clarify it tonight. We'll talk about the great philosophers of the time. And again, there's so many of them, but for test purposes, we probably can narrow it down. If it's going to be the French, probably Voltaire, Rousseau, or Diderot will probably be the most important one. Montesquieu is also important in the case of government, and Adam Smith. And then we'll finally talk about women in the Enlightenment, and maybe if we have some time, mention also enlightened absolute monarchs. All right, so let's start in the beginning, asking the question, setting up for tonight's stream. The question is, what is enlightenment? Which, again, if you might also want to remember, Immanuel Kant wrote a famous essay asking what is enlightenment. So that can also be a primary source to talk about. So Immanuel Kant, a Prussian philosopher, asking what is enlightenment, kind of the manifesto of the time. So the general years of the Enlightenment is 1650 to 1790, which again, we're talking about this is happening during the stages of the English Revolution. The English Revolution, the Civil War in England actually is around the 1640s, so it has influence on it. And the English Revolution is in 1688. So the English Revolution also falls under the period of Enlightenment. Most people just think Enlightenment, they're thinking about the French Revolution, which is actually the end of the period of Enlightenment. So the English Revolution is a part of that. The historical context, why do we have the Enlightenment? As a big you have to make the connection for the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution just happens before that. So we have people like Copernicus, of course, if you studied, or Galileo Galilei, questioning classic beliefs and in science. So they're definitely have a lot of influence on the philosophers in France and all across Europe. And the motto of the Enlightenment, if we mention Immanuel Kant in his famous essay, What is Enlightenment, is dare to think. So basically challenging people to start turning the light bulb and start thinking about it. And skepticism is very, very rampant during the age of the Enlightenment. People are thinking about starting to question everything and not accepting everything they've been taught. So that's kind of the classic viewpoint maybe of the Middle Ages, just accepting everything, not questioning everything. God is in charge of everything. God is everywhere. And now with the Enlightenment, they're starting to question everything. Another thing where we want to connect to the Enlightenment is there's a general belief that human progress was possible and a positive thing. So the Enlightenment is all thinking about the human progress as being positive, moving. Anytime people are gaining more knowledge, they're moving forward, is always a positive thing. It's kind of like maybe the opposite of Romanticism, the saying progress is good. Enlightenment thinkers are thinking progress. Enlightenment thinkers thinking progress is good. Romanticism said progress created a lot of damages. We should look back into the past. Enlightenment figures are also very optimistic for the future versus romantics who are more pessimistic. So Enlightenment thinkers are thinking that when we have knowledge and we discover things and we kind of discovered how the laws of human existence are cooperating, then we probably will create a better society and better people. They also have a lot of influence of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton in his laws kind of explaining all of nature. So he's also, Isaac Newton is also a big influencer of the age of the Enlightenment, thinking about that nature all has laws, everything makes sense. If we understand them, we understand how people operate, then we can have a better society. So let's summarize the values of the Enlightenment. What does Enlightenment stand for? Here are kind of the big buzzwords you want to remember probably for Enlightenment. First word is reason. That's probably one of the favorite words of the Philosophers. The man is a logical person. He can come to the right conclusion by using his reason. Progress, moving forward, is always a positive thing. They think of society just constantly progressing, moving upwards, gaining more knowledge. Things like the Encyclopedia, gathering knowledge from everywhere. Progress is a positive thing. Liberty, so that's another thing that could be a big influencer when we get to effects of the Enlightenment. We can get to the French Revolution or the American Revolution or the English Revolution. So liberty, the freedom of the people, is something that is also a big concept of Enlightenment figures that are starting to question the current forms of government. It's not that all of them are saying monarchs are bad, but they're starting to think about liberty. Toleration. Enlightenment thinkers are starting to have more appreciation for freedom of religion, that certain maybe other religious groups should be tolerated by the state. Hope. So another thing we might want to connect it to progress. We can think about Enlightenment figures, maybe other than Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a little pessimistic. We can generally say that most of Enlightenment thinkers are actually very positive and optimistic about the future. Natural law, that's something we might want to connect with John Locke, for example, that the nature has certain laws and man has to find his way through it. Science was a big thing, influencer, maybe the context, as we mentioned, for the Enlightenment thinkers, but they were also very interested in science and trying to explain some things in scientific way. And finally, one of the biggest buzzwords for Enlightenment thinkers is the idea of deism. So Enlightenment thinkers will talk about deism later on in details, but they're moving from a Christian society to kind of a society like progress that believes that God is not in control of everything and influential on every aspect. This is, again, one way to get eventually to atheism. So we have religious people, then we start having deist people starting to think that God is not involved in everything. And finally, the end of the road is people who believe that like all the way to God does not exist. So let's talk a little bit about deism or deists. We think that most, or assume that most of the philosophers, French word for philosophers, were deists. So according to the deists, their belief system, the creator does not intervene in human affairs anymore, or basically is not involved in the natural laws of the universe. So kind of like Isaac Newton wrote a little bit about that, that God is kind of like, another way to explain it is kind of the clockmaker, the big brains of the operation. He created the universe, he designed everything, and now he is kind of stepped away and he's not involved in things anymore. So many of the philosophers, we can call them deists, or they are part of deism, which again, it's kind of hard to explain exactly what they believe in, but they believe that God is not involved in things anymore. And that can also put a man in the center of place, being in charge of his destiny. That's something that already started to develop in the Renaissance, when people felt studying the studies of humanism, that man is in the center and man is in charge of his future. Renaissance thinkers were all very, very Christian. Now we're moving 200 years, 150 years plus forward, and we're seeing that people are starting to even decrease more the importance of God and increase the influence of man in the center of things. So deism is one big thing we want to remember regarding the philosophers. Now let's talk about the philosophers. So it's a big group of many, many thinkers. There are many of them. There's more than 30 of them. We can't think about all of them together. right now, but let's just basically generalize who are the Philosophes, and then we'll talk specifically about several of them. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop in the ask a question feature in the bottom here. We're having still people coming into the discussion as we go along. So let's talk about the Philosophes. So the Philosophes are, most of them come from the middle class and from the nobility. So we barely have anyone who really comes from poverty. Maybe Jean-Jacques Rousseau comes from a humble background. His father was a watchmaker, but most of them have access to knowledge or wealth. I mean, like to sit and to read and write, that's kind of a more of a privileged thing. So most of them, we can generalize, come from middle class and nobility. Most of them are French. So definitely the center of Enlightenment is in France, in Salons society. So Paris is the center of the Enlightenment. If you kind of remember all the movies or seen kind of like, if anyone's seen the series John Adams, if you kind of see the Salon and John Adams, or sorry, Benjamin Franklin meeting kind of the ladies of Paris and having all these conversations, that's kind of the Salon environment that is happening during that time. And even the French language basically became kind of the language of the intellectuals during that time. And from France and from Paris, basically the Enlightenment spread all across Europe. And the Philosophes kind of called for the freedom of expression and battle of censorship, especially under the control of Louis XV. Louis XV, grandson of Louis XIV, was not a big fan of publications of books that he felt were threatening his form of government. So there's definitely something to be said about how the Philosophes were, sometimes their book were censored, and they were constantly talking about how they're interested in having freedom of expression, and how they were not interested in the government closing, not allowing them to have their writing being published. Let me see why it's not working here. All right. If we need a founding father for the Philosophe, we definitely can start in thinking about John Locke as a founding member of the Philosophe. John Locke, if you took APUSH or studied American history, you might want to remember him if you're going to take him next year. If you're taking APUSH or you took him before, probably very, very influential person. He's one of the early people in England. He supports, by the way, the English Revolution and writes about it. He's one of the kind of like the founding fathers of the Enlightenment movement. So early on, he brought things such as into the forefront, things that's talking about the first time to talk about religious toleration. There should be some religious toleration. Many followers in France followed that idea. He talked about social contract. And again, that's not his invention. Many other writers talked about the idea of the social contract. Jean-Jacques Rousseau talked about it. Thomas Hobbes wrote about it. But his idea of social contract was that the government has a duty for its people. The government basically were elected to protect people. And the radical part of his idea was saying if the government is not doing a good job protecting the people's rights, then the government should be abolished or replaced. That's a very, very radical thing to say, that if government is doing a bad job, you can replace them. But that's something that John Locke wrote about. And that idea had a lot of influence on future leaders, such as, if we want to give one specific example. And again, in this new exam, you need two pieces of outside evidence. So two pieces of outside evidence. One of them could definitely be Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the American Declaration of Independence. So John Locke wrote about people that are born with natural rights. And he spoke about life, liberty, and property. And Thomas Jefferson basically, I want to say copy exactly the same thing, but influence in that. Anyone knows what Thomas Jefferson replaced property with when he wrote the American Declaration of Independence? And remember the Declaration of Independence? Instead of life, liberty, he wrote pursuit of happiness. Very good. So yes, we just replaced the property with pursuit of happiness. So we already see now how John Locke was influential on the American Revolution, and later on the same ideas slipped into the French Revolution. So social contract government are created by people. If they're doing a bad thing, they should be replaced. That's exactly what's in the Declaration of Independence, and Jefferson just replaced property with pursuit of happiness, which is also kind of economic sense when Jefferson wrote Pursuit of Happiness. Now, Locke also, as a philosopher, the philosopher constantly talked about human nature and capacities, how we're born, how we get knowledge. They had a lot of arguments. He came up with the theory that people are born what he called tabula rasa, which means in Latin blank slate. So he believed people are born with empty, with a blank slate, an empty brain. There's nothing there. And throughout life, they pick up experiences, and that's how they develop their personality. That's something, people to this day argue about how people are born. So that was his thesis. It was a very, very important idea to come about. Some people believe that we're born already with certain things in our brain. He claimed that it's completely empty. And he says all ideas come based upon experience. That's another thing, kind of like learning from the scientific revolution. If you guys studied empiricism, people experience things, and that's how they come into understanding of things. So to summarize, he believed knowledge is gained from the environment, not necessarily hereditary. That's something that he claimed, that people are born. And the other thing, it's based upon reason, not fate. So taking fate out of the equation. So John Locke is kind of a founding father, bringing us into the Enlightenment movement. Background to it, and he also writes during the English Revolution. If you need a context for writing an essay about the Enlightenment, definitely English Revolution, or even going into John Locke as a founding father. If there's any question, feel free to use the Ask the Question section. All right, let's move on and talk about probably one of the most famous philosophers of the time, and is Voltaire. Voltaire had a very, very long name, but I'll just make it easy for the test. Won't teach you the whole 15 names. Just call him Voltaire. Voltaire is kind of an interesting person. He got into a lot of trouble in his life. He was like an open book, not a PC person, spoke everything that he believed in, and got into a lot of trouble. For example, in 1717, he was imprisoned in the Bastille for 11 months for assaulting a French nobleman. So yeah, he paid for his for his honesty. He lived in exile in England for several years. He was very, very impressed while he was in England with the English political system. And he was a huge fan of Isaac Newton. And he actually popularized many, many things of Isaac Newton and translated him and wrote about him constantly. Now, interesting, another person, Voltaire, is kind of more pessimistic about human nature. So while most of the philosophers are very optimistic about the future and mankind, he's kind of more pessimistic. He advocates religious toleration. That's another big thing for the philosophers. And he's also a very, very big critic of Christianity. So he's constantly in his text is criticizing Christianity and superstition and things like that. Famous quote of Voltaire, if you want to remember for the test: judge a man by his question rather than his answer. So it's kind of like a classic philosopher stance of questions are more important than answer, kind of sets up who the person is by asking the question that he was. So Voltaire traveled all around the place. His general background, he comes from a low nobility. That's something that got him in trouble a lifetime with the high nobility society of France, like that famous incident where he got beaten up and sent to he actually served in the Bastille, the famous Bastille where the French Revolution started. He actually went to prison there, traveled to England. He actually even lived in Prussia under Frederick the Great, who's an example of later, maybe we'll talk at the end about an enlightened absolute monarch, a monarch that is influenced by the Enlightenment, but is still an absolute monarch. So that's something interesting that is happening during that time. Voltaire wrote a lot of works, I think more close than 100 published works that are related to him. Funny enough, the most famous work that he wrote, he would be so surprised that that's the thing that he's remembered for. He actually thought about it as a minor work, is a book called Candide, which I highly recommend to read. You can find it in Barnes and Nobles or online and Amazon for like $5 or something. It's very short and very easy to read. I think it's like less than 100 pages. My version, I think, is like 90 pages. Depends on the font of your book or how many pictures are in it. But it's very, very easy to read. I find my students a lot of times have some problems reading classics, but this is one of those easy books to read. The gist of the book is kind of Candide is kind of like a Forrest Gump character. Anybody seen Forrest Gump, the movie? I don't know. My students today, some of them don't know the Forrest Gump metaphor anymore because a few years passed since Forrest Gump was popular. But Candide is kind of like a Forrest Gump character that basically zigzag across Europe. It starts up that he lives in a noble family. And then he's found kissing a girl and basically gets kicked out of the house. And from that point on, his life goes to all these adventure. Like he's recruited to the army. He's being beaten. He's being tortured. He's going on a shipwreck, Inquisition. All these characters are coming into the book. And Voltaire is basically using this just a regular novel story to kind of pin up all the criticism that he has about fanaticism, religious fanaticism. He attacks like things like the Jesuits, who are seen as radical, crazy people, according to Voltaire in the book. Slavery is a horrible thing, war, colonialism. So Candide is going through all these places and having all these adventures. And this is a way for Voltaire kind of to criticize all these institutions and seeing people as not being like, there's like a character in the book called like John the Anabaptist. So Anabaptist, if you study the Reformation, is a great context if you want, again, use outside evidence. Anabaptists believed in adult baptism, which was a very radical idea for that time. But Voltaire is not seeing anything wrong with Anabaptists, so he brings that character into the book and saying, like, why are you criticizing someone like that? Now, it's also interesting about thinking about Candide in the context of maybe of a dysutopia, basically, which is the antonym of utopia. Like, so Thomas More book Utopia was talking about a perfect society. Candide is under the category of more of a dysutopia, that things are not perfect. It's the opposite of a perfect society. Now, a lot of people also thought about Candide as being written to contradict the German philosopher Leipzig, which had a more positive notions that everything is great, kind of a classic Enlightenment positive way. So Voltaire is writing this book and how Candide is going through all these traumas and all these events. And it's like, how can you be optimistic about mankind if so much stuff is happening in the to Candide? And the last lines of the book, it seems like Candide just kind of returns back and just works the farm, and just kind of like basically at the end he says to his advisor philosopher, just basically, maybe we should just let go of all these fantasies and just work the garden. So it's kind of like a sobering end to the book. Oh, sorry, did I just ruin the end of the book? Anyway, read the book. It's a great book. So that's about Voltaire and his famous work, Candide. Next up, another famous philosopher is Denis Diderot. It's funny the way we said it in English, Denis Diderot, because when I was in college, I had a French teacher philosopher, and she said that name in such a French way. She was like, Denis Diderot. And in America, it's all like Denis Diderot. So it's kind of we butcher his name. But anyway, Diderot, or in French, Diderot, spent like 26 years constantly collecting and building basically his important work, which is the Encyclopedia. And again, today it's kind of like, I don't know if people really understand what a huge breakthrough the Encyclopedia was like 300 plus years ago. It's something like the internet, just gathering all this information. For kids today, like encyclopedia is not a big thing because they Google everything. But in those days, it's basically they collected every field of knowledge and just rounded it up in one major, volumes and volumes of books that cover everything from theology, religion, art, kind of like trying to collect anything that man is attempted to do. So it's kind of like Encyclopedia translate from French, basically the circle of teaching. Sorry, not French, like Greek, like cyclo is like circle, like. But basically, the premise is that you can that human reason can solve everything. So let's basically gather all this knowledge and put it together. So Diderot had a very difficult life. He faced a lot of censorship and he faced a lot of persecution for his writing. So he had to basically move around a little bit, but he was very, very happy to put all of his effort behind the Encyclopedia. And another example of enlightened absolute monarchs interested in these philosophers, Catherine the Great of Russia was a financial backer of Denis Diderot, and she corresponded with letters with him. So these philosophers, they're bringing new ideas that might threaten, the establishment, but monarchs are very interested in knowledge, are very interested in communicating with people like the Enlightenment thinkers. Now, here's probably the biggest, most important person I see for the Enlightenment. Every teacher is probably picking somebody else. I see Jean-Jacques Rousseau as probably being the most influential philosopher of that time, because his writing really, really influenced things in the long term, either books that influenced the French Revolution or books that influenced how to educate kids that are being taught to this day. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau does not come from the noble families. He comes from more of a lower class. His father was a watchmaker. He's not the best role model in a personal life. He had several children that he basically left for adoption. Some historians see him as a founding father of the Romantic movement, because many of his ideas, like going back to nature, that progress is not necessarily a positive thing, these are kind of the foundation of the Romantic movement. If you're not familiarized with the Romantic movement, I suggest you might want to see a stream or two about the Romantic movements, or check up some information about it. That can also be in the test. He developed ideas such as the noble savage. So while all the philosophers always saw progress in getting more education and being more sophisticated as a positive things, he was starting to bring this idea that maybe native people, who are more in nature, are basically the people who are the most developed. The idea of kind of like a noble savage, especially if we talk about a time when people discovered the new world and discovered these new societies, and a lot of people said these people are savages, then certain philosophers said, well, maybe they're more connected to nature, maybe they're more developed than us. So that's another thing that he's famous for, the idea of a noble savage. Or maybe the idea of that people left to themselves in nature in a lot of better situation before he's trying to regulate and put laws into place. So here, let's talk about also Rousseau was very, very prolific. We're not going to talk about all of his works. Let's talk about 3 of his major works that you might see in the test. A Discourse of Science and Arts, that's the first major work that he wrote and that made him famous. The Social Contract, which again, he did not invent the terms of social contract. As we mentioned, Hobbes, Rousseau, and other people spoke about it before. And finally, Emile, also called On Education, which was a book about raising kids. That's another important thing that Rousseau is bringing into the picture, how to raise kids. That's an interesting question to ask. So Rousseau first makes a reputation for himself when he is entering kind of like an Enlightenment competition of that time in that area. There's basically a competition, and people have to write an essay answering the question. And the question is, does progress in the arts and in science correspond with progress in morality? So that's an interesting question. An interesting prompt if you guys thinking about DBQ. So anyways, a classic Enlightenment question saying, if you break it down, if art and science is progressing, do people become better people, basically? And the classic Enlightenment question to that thing would be, anyone can answer, what would Enlightenment thinker answer a question like this? Would they say yes or no? What do you think? So the Enlightenment thinkers of the time, or anyone who entered this competition, they just assumed that, of course, they're going to answer yes. Of course, progress in arts and science will make people better as moral people. So that was the assumption, that everyone will answer that question and yes, and trying to explain, because that's how they would win the competition. But Rousseau took a very, very different thesis. He actually went that civilization progress actually moves people away from morals. The more they progress, they're becoming worse people. Therefore, basically, a revival of science does not correspond. So his answer was no. But funny enough, he won the competition. That's one of these odd things. How would he win the competition if he said no? They're expecting a yes. I had a college professor that said that he probably won the competition because they thought that he's being like, like a cynic or something like that, or he's being like, comical about it, kind of like a Machiavelli situation, but he was serious. Anyways, this is one of those misunderstanding situations. Another very, very influential work, you might want to remember this if you get an essay about raising kids, education, women as outside evidence. This is great outside evidence for the exam, is the book called Emile, or On Education, a book that he kind of wrote as a novel, but basically as a manual to teach you how to raise a child. And he argued basically that children should be treated as individual, and not basically not just basically that childhood is a certain period in life. So most people basically just had kids and then they just saw them as like people who work in the house or work in factories, but they never really had childhood. So Rousseau is basically starting to put up a thesis that childhood is a distinct experience or period in life that children should learn by researching and figuring things from themselves, that they need to follow their heart and not their head. So many of the concepts that we have today about raising kids are actually starting from Rousseau. Ideas such as playtime being a very important thing. That's what people don't get, like going downstairs to the playgrounds and kids playing around. That whole idea of play is something that Rousseau is developing. That kids need to learn from their own experiences. That's something that he talks about in the book. Like, let's say he says in the book, like, let's say a kid broke a window, like the classic punishment, like, you might hit him to discipline him from that mistake that he did. Rousseau is more like, leave him in the room with a broken window and he's going to learn from being cold at night. That's how he's going to learn from his mistake. He's talking a lot about sentiment also, but interesting enough, we can also use this book about more the concept of, sexism, because the book is focused on a man. Emile is a boy, and throughout the book, he's talking about raising a boy. But then another part of the book, he's starting to talk about a girl, and the girl is named Sophie. And in the book, it seems very clear that Emile has to pursue his interests. He's got potential. We need to invest in him. But when it comes to Sophie, this is where the sexist in Rousseau comes out. He basically believes that Sophie should just be the supporting role for Emile, that she should be a woman as Emile is supposed to be a boy. Basically, stay at home, raise the kids, do the cooking and cleaning. So he's definitely not founding father of the feminists. So if you need an evidence or writing about male chauvinism or male domination during that time, you can definitely use Rousseau as basically kind of reflecting this society that is very patriarchal towards women. Now, one woman that specifically stood up against Rousseau is Mary Wollstonecraft, that we mentioned later on, and she rejected many of the ideas in the book Emile. So Emile was banned in Paris, and it was publicly burned and the year of its publication. So it wasn't like well received by the establishment, but later on it caught on and became more popular. And finally, last major work that we want to mention regarding Rousseau is probably a book that he wrote called The Social Contract. And again, we have mentioned that Thomas Hobbes had an idea about the social contract. He wrote a book called Leviathan, and Thomas Hobbes claimed in Leviathan that the social contract is basically men give power to kings, and kings in return give protection to people. That's what the social contract. That's what Thomas Hobbes in England wrote. Then John Locke said the social contract is actually men give protection, king gives protection to the people. The people are willing to accept the king domination over them, but if the king is doing a bad job, then they can remove him. So different theses about what the social contract. Finally, Rousseau comes into the picture, and he has another different POV or point of view on the whole idea of the social contract. He's bringing in two important terms you might want to write down if you write Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He gives us two concepts. One is called the general will, which is very, very influential on the French Revolution. And another thing is the idea of popular sovereignty, kind of like what the majority wants. That's another important thing that he writes. One of the most famous parts of the social contract, the early stages of the book that he writes, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chain. That basically, it's interesting that man is like born like free in nature when he talks about the natural laws, that man was born free. But if you look around everywhere, basically he is in chain. And again, you might quote something like this in the test and it might be impressive. It's not necessarily that you wrote the whole book, but it sounds like that. So he's starting to talk about, okay, so in early times, there's the natural environment. He's similar in his saying to John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. There was kind of chaos in society, and then man basically steps in and establishes government. So he's starting to talk about the best society is a society that follows the general will, which is kind of hard to explain, but basically what's the majority of the group is thinking, that's what should happen to everyone. So it's like if you were in a classroom and the teacher asks, you want to do this, you want to do that, and the group decides we want to do that, that's the general will. There's a few group of kids who are saying, I don't know, if like the teacher says, let's watch this documentary, and a group of kids saying, I don't want to watch this documentary, it offends me or stuff like that. Rousseau will say if the majority of the group wanted to do that, that's the general will. You have to follow it. So he doesn't really care about minority rights. And some people kind of see him as kind of like a prototype of socialist, kind of like whatever the group, the majority wants, everyone has to follow, not really care about the small group. That's also something that was very, very popular in the French Revolution. Many leaders of the French Revolution, like Robespierre, were huge fan of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and carried the social contract book with them and constantly talked about that. But he's not giving like unlimited power to the king. He also basically is against the whole divine right of kings. So that's another similar thing that he has with Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. He just has a different viewpoint on the social contract. He's saying more popular sovereignty and the general will. So that's pretty much what you need to know about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And finally, to finish it up, let's talk about Montesquieu, who's a very influential philosopher, very influential on the American Revolution, interestingly enough. Wrote a famous work called The Spirit of the Laws. And use Enlightenment thinking basically to start thinking about the structure of government. So most of Europe at that time, we're talking about the writing in the 18th century. Most governments have absolute monarchs. England is one of the few places where we have more of a constitutional monarchy when the monarch is kind of limited in power. And Montesquieu is coming over and putting into the surface the idea of checks and balances and the separation of power. So basically, instead of having one monarch that has all the powers, how about we divide and create different branches of government? Kind of like what we have in America, the executive branch, kind of the judicial branch, the executive branch kind of like under a president that is the head of the system, the judicial branch that kind of regulates the laws, and Congress, which is kind of the legislative branch that passes the laws. So instead of having one person in complete control, having several groups of people that each one of them three separate bodies that kind of check each other's power. So nobody has unlimited power. So these are still kind of the new ideas that are coming into the surface. Instead of absolute monarchy, maybe we can divide the power. But don't get the wrong impression that Enlightenment thinkers were against monarchs. All of them supported the monarchy. A lot of them were very afraid of kind of like popular democracy, but they're starting to question or trying to figure out maybe a little bit new systems to put in place. Finally, if we talk about economics a little bit, one person, a very, very influential person who was a philosopher during that time who's not French, his name is Adam Smith. He's from Scotland. He's referred to a lot of time. If you're going to go to business school, I'm sure you're going to study this guy a lot. He's referred to as the father of capitalism, and he really supported the growth of the middle class. So remember also the context of the Enlightenment. We're starting to talk about European society is starting to experience the growth of the middle class, more educated people, cafes, salons. And he's starting to talk about kind of a similar idea to John Locke, that the government role is to protect property of people. He's bringing ideas such as in French called laissez-faire, which talks about government not interfering in the economy. Laissez-faire kind of means, from loose translation from French to English, it's kind of like live and let be, kind of leave me alone. So he's going against the more popular economic system of the time, which is mercantilism. During that time, mercantilism was the command economy, that kind of the government controlled everything and put tariffs, taxes on imports, and trying to manufacture everything by themselves, regulates what people are selling and buying. And Adam Smith comes up with idea of a free market economy. Basically, let people trade, don't put regulation, let people do what they want to do in their economy, and the economy will self-regulate itself. So all of these ideas are coming in his most famous book called The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, the year of the American Revolution. So that's an easy way to remember that. And basically saying the economy is regulated by itself with the thing called the invisible hand. The invisible hand kind of basically fixes the economy. So government, back off, don't regulate, let the economy move by itself, and it will flourish. That's something, by the way, that, like, let's say, not to get too political, that's something the Republican Party in the United States supports today. So it's kind of confusing for students. I also teach APUSH. It's kind of confusing for students to say that Adam Smith is a liberal, a classic liberal, but Republicans love him. How can that be? So he believes in economic liberalism. That's something conservative people believe in today. But in his days, that's something conservative people were really, really afraid. They wanted the government to be in control. So Wealth of Nations, very important book. Adam Smith, Scottish philosopher, known as the father of modern capitalism. So how all of these ideas spread around the world. So we talked about all these philosophers. All of them are writing books. You probably study about the printing press, so it's not like a few copies. They can have thousands of copies are being spread around. So the ideas of the philosophes or philosophers in English are being spread first in salons, which we can see in the painting over here. This is a very interesting sphere. This is a sphere actually where women have an opportunity to be influential, because women are kind of hostesses to these events, and philosophers and intellectual people come over there and have conversation and discussion. And sometimes they might have celebrities, famous people like Benjamin Franklin, who was the American ambassador to France for a while, who was also in salon society. Another places to have other than salons is the coffee houses, cafes, where, thinking about drinking a coffee is also kind of more of a sobering drink that we want to associate with the Enlightenment figures. Like seeing alcohol is something more maybe of a lower class thing. So coffee is something that sobers you up and makes you more focused. That's another place to spread the idea of the Enlightenment. Reading clubs, people start having reading clubs, kind of like what we have today are like a book club that people read a certain book and have discussion about it. Novels are also started to develop around that time. Novel, like coming from the word like novelty, something that is new. A lot of time fictional book. We have public libraries, lending libraries are being created for the first time in Europe. So we have now a larger reading crowds that can read books that are cheaper, either in coffee places or going into libraries if they cannot afford to buy the book. We also have societies that are being created around certain ideas that people are thinking about, like the Freemason. Though, interesting enough, Benjamin Franklin also belonged to the Free Mason Society, secret societies, and that's also another way of spreading ideas or talking about the ideas of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment starts up in Paris, France, and is spreading across Europe, starting the salons, coffee house, libraries, and so forth. But mainly the reading publication that is going around. But again, not to take the wrong impression, it's not that most regular people are average people on the street are reading Enlightenment articles, but the ideas are starting to spread more in the middle class intellectual elite until they kind of sip down. If we want to make the connection when it comes to the revolution, these ideas are translated from the philosophers to the common people. One more thing before we wrap up is talking about, that will be an interesting DBQ also, if we have women in the Enlightenment, or if we have an essay just dedicated to women in this exam. We might get a thematic exam that will have a broader period of time. So who knows, might include 2 units of history. We do not know. So what is the POV? What's the point of view of philosophers for women during the Enlightenment? One generalization we can start with, a good starting point, is that most philosophers accepted that women are inferior to men intellectually or physically. One example, if you want to prove that in a thesis, as I mentioned, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his writing in Emile definitely is putting into place that man is superior to women and women should basically serve the men. So women did play a role in the Salon society, and some of them also came up as writers during that time. And one specific example is Mary Wollstonecraft, who was an English writer, and she challenged Rousseau's position on women inferiority. One of her most famous work is called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she argued that women have, again, bringing the whole idea of enlightenment, that women have innate reason in them. That's the Enlightenment POV, and they should have exactly the same rights. So the idea that she basically writes about you're attacking women, that they don't have skills, they don't have abilities. She says they don't have it because you're blocking them from getting education. Once you're going to give women exactly the same education as men, then you're going to see that their potential is equal exactly to the men. That's what she's saying. She's also goes on to talk about that inequality is perceived a lot of time in marriage, which she sees it as a contract. She actually compares it in the book to like being in jail, the whole process of marriage. So she's also talks about that. That's why some people seeing her as like a feminist or the founding woman, the leader of the feminist movement. So if you get a feminism DBQ, you can also plug in Mary Wollstonecraft in that category. That's the thing. You might want to use one person into a couple of different angles. It's not just one thing. Rousseau is not just Enlightenment. Rousseau can be also for education. Rousseau, you can use them talking about women. Rousseau, you can use them how to raise children, founder of the Romantic movement. So some of these people can work in different ways. And finally, last thing for tonight is the Enlightened Absolute Monarchs. So the last thing, anyone recognize any of these people over here? If you want to write the name or two, if you can think of the first Enlightenment Absolute Monarchs that you study or know of. Interesting, Enlightened Absolute Monarchs are, it's kind of might be a contradiction in the name, kind of an oxymoron, that you're enlightened, but you're still absolute. How can that be? So interesting enough, during that time, we have several, across Europe, we have several monarchs like Frederick the Great over here on the left, or Catherine the Great in, so he's in Prussia, Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, the monarch of Russia, and Joseph the Second of Austria. He doesn't get the great, but he actually is the only great, I believe, from the three of them. It's funny how history is written that way. So again, what makes them enlightened monarchs? These people are all a big fans of the philosophy, as we mentioned. Frederick the Great actually invites Voltaire to live with him. He actually reads a lot of intellectual writings and writes for himself. Catherine the Great sponsored Diderot. So all of these people are very interested in Enlightenment thinkers, and some of them are showing some religious toleration, like Joseph II gives religious toleration to Jews for the first time, and Frederick the Great is accepting other Christian faith in his kingdom. But at the end of the day, they're still absolute monarchs. So that's kind of the contradiction, or you might get an essay, are they more enlightened? Are they more absolute? So another legacy of the Enlightenment movement is we have these absolute monarchs that are coming across Europe, more intellectual, more interested in knowledge, but still dictatorial in their powers. So remember to think Fibeable, everyone, on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. And remember, there's constant updates coming up, so check your emails if there's updates about the exam format. We're constantly getting new details, how to sign up for the exam or things like that, in case your teacher is not keeping you updated. There's a link also here for my book, Qigong for Beginners, if you're looking for a book about some meditation, physical exercise for relaxation or martial arts. So check out my book, Qigong for Beginners. Qigong is kind of a form of Tai Chi, which is Chinese martial arts. All right, so let's get into Q&A. If there's any questions to finish our stream for tonight. Any questions about the Enlightenment or about any general questions regarding the exam coming up? Questions about the DBQ or anything like that? You can ask the question in the bottom here or in the chat. Also, I think next week there was going to be one general Q&A hosted on the AP room, so check out the details for that. All right, if there's no questions for tonight, thank you all for joining this live stream. Good luck to everyone in the exam. My name is Liam Macklin. I'd like to thank you for joining. Good night and good luck, everyone.